For a long time, the image sold was that of an indestructible bloc, a united, disciplined party, willing to support its leader under any circumstances. That image didn't collapse all at once, it cracked. And it didn't crack due to a sudden ethical awakening or belated courage. It cracked because in real politics, there's a clear limit between loyalty and self-preservation. When a Republican publicly declares, "I can no longer support," the impact isn't just in the words, it's in the timing. This type of statement doesn't arise when the ground is secure. It appears when staying costs more than leaving. When remaining means inheriting political damage that can no longer be explained, let alone defended. That's exactly where Donald Trump finds himself. Behind the scenes, the equation is simple and brutal. Trump has ceased to be an electoral asset and has become a concentrated risk. The wear and tear aren't theoretical. They materialize in images, episodes, public reactions, and consequences that slip out of control. ICE, elevated to a political symbol, has become the center of a problem the party can no longer absorb without bleeding. Every new controversial action adds weight. Every rush statement increases the damage. Every attempt to harden the rhetoric accelerates rejection outside the most loyal base. For Republicans running in real elections, this isn't an ideological debate, it's survival instinct. They know how to read polls. They can tell when the tide turns. And they can recognize when a central figure starts dragging everyone around, down with them. The fear now isn't about losing percentage points. It's about being crushed in the upcoming midterm elections. That's why movement begins. First discreet, then cautious, now open. It's no coincidence. This distancing is emerging in strategic areas of the party. Senators feel it first. State-level candidates pick up quickly. When defending Trump means carrying chaos along with the name on the ballot, the choice stops being emotional. It becomes mathematical. But the most serious signal didn't come just from the political field. Something even more sensitive started to shift. The withdrawal of historically aligned media voices. When outlets that for years cushioned crises begin to openly question the government's conduct, the impact is profound. Not because they've changed sides, but because they've recognized the narrative no longer holds. When words like moral fiasco enter the vocabulary of traditional allies, the shield falls. And when the shield falls, the leader is exposed to what he's always tried to avoid: raw facts. Trump built his strength by betting on permanent confrontation. He wagered that noise would muffle reality, that repetition would overpower evidence, that the party would remain closed out of fear, convenience, or calculation. That bet worked as long as he could control the pace of the story. Now, the rhythm has slipped away. The most revealing part is that Trump himself sees it. That's why he's starting to adjust his tone. He tries to appear conciliatory, talks of cooperation, tries to convey normalcy. Not because he's changed his convictions, but because the political space has shrunk. When aggression stops yielding support and begins generating desertion, retreat becomes necessary. However, this move doesn't sound like wisdom. It sounds like weakness. And weakness, in the political world Trump built, is fatal. The base senses it. Allies calculate, the undecided watch. Each step backward confirms the perception that something is out of control. It's in this context that the most symbolic gesture so far appears: a Republican who not only breaks with Trump, but abandons his own election campaign, not as a tactical maneuver, but as a statement of limits. He's not just rejecting a name, he's rejecting the cost of being associated with a project that turned against ordinary citizens. This is the turning point. When discomfort leaves the backstage and becomes public declaration, the crisis shifts stages. It becomes unmanageable. And when that happens, the problem is no longer the opposition. It's a system trying to protect itself from someone who became too heavy to carry. Every political downfall usually has an exact point where the story stops being controllable. A moment when official versions can no longer keep up with the facts. For Donald Trump, That point arrived when ICE's actions crossed any margin of political ambiguity and entered the realm of irreversible public exposure. In recent weeks, what was previously treated as strict law enforcement began to be seen as something very different. A 37-year-old man died after an encounter with federal agents. The government's reaction was immediate and predictable. Harsh statements, quick justifications, an attempt to frame the episode as an extreme security threat. The problem is, this time, the narrative didn't survive contact with the images. Authorities stated the individual posed imminent danger. They said agents feared for their lives. They insinuated violent intentions. But as videos began to circulate, every official statement started to collapse. What was seen did not confirm what was said. And when the gap between speech and reality becomes visible, trust dissolves. That was the fatal mistake. The administration insisted on doubling down, tried to uphold the version despite growing scrutiny, but the effect was the opposite. What could have been handled cautiously became a symbol of abuse, of rashness, and of contempt for public intelligence. And when that happens, the debate stops being partisan. It becomes moral. Traditionally, conservative media outlets realized this quickly. The tone changed. Editorial after editorial began using words rarely associated with Trump's presidency: fiasco, irresponsibility, unnecessary provocation. It was no longer ideological disagreement. It was a cold damage assessment. The most biting criticism came precisely from where Trump least expected. When a newspaper historically aligned with the conservative establishment states that the weight of the incident falls directly on the president, the message is clear. There's no longer a way to outsource blame. The agency's control is direct. The responsibility, non-transferable. This media break had a domino effect within the party. Lawmakers who had remained silent began calling for investigations. Senators began distancing themselves from the official rhetoric, not because they suddenly discovered a new sense of justice, but because they realized continuing to defend the indefensible would be political suicide. Trump tried to react the way he always did, attacking, downplaying, distorting. Then he changed strategies, started using a conciliatory tone, spoke of cooperation with local authorities, claimed everything was being done to reduce crime. The contrast was obvious. The same leader who incited the base was now trying to seem reasonable. This retreat wasn't interpreted as prudence. It was read as weakness. And meanwhile, a question was growing among moderate voters and even traditional conservatives. If this happened in broad daylight, with cameras rolling, what else was done away from the public eye? The sense that something was being hidden spread quickly, especially when reports emerged of attempts to disqualify recordings, discredit witnesses, and intimidate those filming. None of this helped Trump. Quite the opposite. Every new control attempt reinforced the idea that the problem wasn't an isolated incident, but a sustained pattern. And patterns, once exposed, don't disappear with official statements. It was in this climate that the most forceful political gesture occurred. A Republican, directly involved in previous cases, decided to end his own campaign for state governor. Not only distanced himself from Trump, but also rejected the party identity at that moment. He said he could no longer support a project that, according to him, turned against ordinary citizens. This statement carried enormous symbolic weight. It turned internal discomfort into public rupture and showed what many had suspected. The party was divided between protecting the leader or trying to save its own electoral survival. Donald Trump always understood power as narrative control, not just persuasion, suppression, diversion, suffocating alternative versions until only one story remained. For years, this strategy worked because it relied on three pillars: loyal media allies, permissive platforms, and a fragmented public. This time, however, one of those pillars collapsed, then another, and then the third. The central error was underestimating something that can no longer be controlled as before: the camera in the hands of ordinary citizens. When the first recordings of the incident that killed Alex Prey emerged, the reaction was automatic. Authorities tried to discredit the material, suggested selective editing, claimed incomplete angles. bet that the initial confusion would be enough to dilute outrage. But the volume of footage grew, and it grew fast. Each new video reinforced the previous. Each new testimony closed a gap. What Trump and his team didn't anticipate was the spontaneous coordination. Ordinary people, without newsrooms, editorials, or major sponsors, began documenting everything, driven not by ideology, but by instinct. By that simple and powerful feeling that if it weren't filmed, it would be denied. That was the turning point. The attempt at silencing moved from rhetoric to intimidation. People filming reported vague threats, hints of being added to watch lists, indirect pressure. Nothing explicit enough to make headlines alone, but enough to create fear. The problem is, the fear was also recorded. And when the act of intimidating becomes content, the effect reverses. Trump always bet that information overload would confuse. But the opposite happened: clarity. Official versions began to seem overly choreographed. Contradictions became obvious. And worse for the administration, a local judge intervened to preserve evidence that, according to reports, was already being tampered with. That detail changed everything because it was no longer a narrative dispute. It was procedural, legal, institutional. The fact that a judge appointed within the very system acted to prevent the disappearance of evidence destroyed the last argument that it was all political hysteria. From that point, the collapse accelerated. Republican senators began calling for formal investigations, not in fiery tones, but calculated ones. The implicit message was clear. No one wanted to be associated with a possible cover-up. And cover-ups don't forgive allies. They drag everyone. Meanwhile, Trump did what he always did: changed the focus, spoke of cooperation with governors, tried to frame the situation as part of a broader crime-fighting strategy. The rhetoric was almost conciliatory, but it was already too late. The contrast between the previous tone and the new one sounded artificial, like someone trying to walk back after the truth escaped. And then came the most revealing detail: flight. Reports indicated that agents involved had left the state, not for rest, not for administrative routine, but out of the immediate reach of local authorities. For many, this confirmed the worst suspicion. Those confident in their version don't flee scrutiny. Those who fear investigation do. At that moment, the question shifted from what happened to why are they trying to prevent us from finding out? That shift is fatal for any government because it turns citizens into investigators and spectators into active participants. That's why the attempt to demand body cameras lost meaning. The cameras already existed. The problem wasn't a lack of recording. It was the attempt to control the fate of those recordings. Erase, edit, reinterpret. But this time, the material wasn't on a single server. It was spread, copied, reposted, out of reach. Trump built his strength, believing he could pressure platforms, billionaire allies, and media conglomerates to shape the information flow. But when the story fragments across thousands of phones, that power dissolves. When narrative control breaks down completely, power changes hands. It leaves offices, carefully crafted statements, rehearsed press conferences, and passes to the streets, to communities, to ordinary people living the real consequences of top-down decisions. That's exactly what happened once the images circulated and the official version stopped holding. What emerged wasn't just outrage, it was organization. In Minnesota, the reaction went beyond the classic protest format. What was seen was continuous presence, community support, people protecting each other, documenting, recording, observing. There was no search for confrontation. There was something deeper, a collective refusal to be erased from their own history. That detail dismantles one of the most recurring narratives used to justify excesses, the idea that victims provoked, resisted, or put themselves at risk. The man who died was not leading a political action. He posed no threat. He existed in his community and intervened to protect someone in danger, something any minimally functional society recognizes as human. When that kind of action is treated as a threat, the social contract breaks. And that's when the law and order discourse loses meaning. Law without proportionality becomes brute force. Order without humanity becomes fear. And fear may impose temporary silence, but it never builds lasting stability. It only hastens collapse. Meanwhile, Donald Trump was trying to reposition his image. The tone changed. The words became softer. References to cooperation, common sense, and de-escalation appeared. But the public saw what was really at stake. It wasn't reflection. It was damage control. This retreat had a devastating side effect within the party itself, because Trump built his leadership on constant aggression. When that kind of leadership retreats, it doesn't look prudent, it looks cornered. The base senses hesitation. Allies recalculate risks. The undecided conclude something broke, and something, indeed, broke. We're not just talking about a president under pressure. We're talking about a party facing an uncomfortable choice. Carry this weight to the bottom, or try to save what's left of its institutional credibility. Every senator calling for investigation, every candidate stepping back, every campaign abandoned sends the same silent message. Trump no longer protects those who stand by him. The cost of association has become too high. At the same time, communities in other states are watching, not with distant curiosity, but with alertness. The unspoken question circulates strongly. If this happened there, could it happen here? That question erodes any government because it turns empathy into vigilance and vigilance into resistance. That's why the response from local leaderships gained so much strength, not as party rhetoric, but as a statement of basic principles. Law? Yes. Order? Yes. But not at the cost of lives treated as disposable. Not at the cost of silence imposed by fear. When that message crosses ideological bubbles, the impact is profound. People who once considered themselves non-political begin to realize that neutrality offers no shelter. That avoiding debate doesn't prevent power from reaching your door. That simply existing is no longer a guarantee of safety when excess becomes normalized. This crisis reveals something Trump never managed to fully control: the human reaction to visible abuse. Not organized militancy, not traditional opposition, but the collective instinct to preserve dignity when boundaries are crossed. That's why this moment doesn't resemble previous scandals. It's not about a poorly phrased sentence. It's not about a symbolic gesture. It's about images, actions, and consequences. It's about a system pushed until it showed its hardest face and a country forced to look at it. From here on out, the central question is no longer what Donald Trump will do next. The question is what will be done with what has already been seen. Because once the truth is recorded, shared, and understood, silence is no longer comfortable. It becomes complicity. And at that point, there is no neutrality. There is only choice.